The name Karageorgas, or Karageorgas, was known 850 years ago in my grandfather's village of Valtasinico, and is said to possibly be connected to Georgia Karageorga, a Serbian freedom fighter whose son Alexander eventually became monarch of Greece in the 1920s. My grandfather, John Karageorgas, had his name shortened like thousands of other immigrants. He became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1926 while stationed at Camp Cody, New Mexico. The Army shortened his name to Carras, but his plight to America started way before then. My great-uncle Nick, having come to America sometime in the early 1900s, sent for his younger brother John to come to America when my grandfather was only 11 years old. Somehow in the shuffle, my grandfather was returned to Greece. However, he returned 2 years later. When he left Greece the second time, someone put a tag around his neck, similar to shipping freight, giving his name, where he was going, and who he was supposed to meet. He slept in the lower decks with other immigrants on his voyage to America, and eventually arrived in New York City. Nick moved to Kansas City at the urging of a second cousin, and began working in a restaurant, and again sent for my grandfather. Business was not going so well, so Nick went to San Francisco just in time to experience the great earthquake, and soon returned to Kansas City, where he opened a restaurant at 9th and Baltimore, where my grandfather also worked. Eventually, they opened another restaurant at 31st and Main, but my grandfather became dissatisfied and joined the Army during World War I in 1918. Even though he was only a mess sergeant, my grandfather was a proud soldier. He was a passionate young man with a touch of the Greek philosopher who enjoyed expressing himself with poetry. While stationed at Camp MacArthur, Texas in 1918, he wrote the following.
Respect to his flag. Looking at the flag, he sees into the stars and stripes his country in a whole. Looking more deep, he sees the very place where he stands. At the edges, he sees himself and all his country army ready for any action against any enemy. In the middle, he sees his government controlling all the forces. He still looks and sees his beloved ones, folks, relatives, and friends. He sees the mountains, the hills, the vales, the rivers, springs, the forest, trees, parks, and gardens. He comes to attention, salutes, and admires how so many things could be seen in such a small piece of cloth. More he looks, more he sees, more he thinks. Is he sleeping and dreaming? No, he is still at attention, facing straight to the flag. Still wonders if all the things he sees into the flag are true. At last he cheers up, he smiles, he feels happy. Now he is sure all he sees are not dreams, but reality. He draws power, feels proud, for being the guardian of all those he sees into his flag. Ready to die for his country, but holds and thinks, if only his life is the very thing his country needs. It is not his wisdom, his power, and bravery in his heart and his skill. His country wants first and last of all his life. John Carras, July 25th, 1918, Camp MacArthur, Texas.
After World War I, my grandfather returned to Kansas City and worked with his brother Nick in various restaurants. In 1928, they opened a restaurant at 39th and Main. Through the years, they had several restaurants. Nick passed away in 1950, having never been married. In 1954, the last restaurant my grandfather owned closed down. My grandmother, Evanthea Pepelis, was born in Tripolis, Arcadia, Greece, in 1903, and came to America in 1921 to live with her sister in Stratford, Connecticut. In 1924, she moved to Kansas City. Her nephew, George Gio Carras, told his boss, Mr. Rappas, that my grandmother had arrived. Acting as a matchmaker, Mr. Rappas went to my grandfather and arrangements to marry were made sight unseen before my grandmother even knew what was transpiring. That Sunday in church, my grandmother anxiously scanned the crowd, wondering which young man was her husband to be. She didn't know that he was working that day and was not in church. The next Sunday they met face to face, and 5 months later married at the Carras residence in Kansas City. They eventually had 4 sons: George, Nick, my father Gus, and Jimmy. The one thing my grandfather had promised my grandmother would she marry him was a big house, which she never received until 3 of her sons were grown. Caring for the needs of 2 grown men, my grandfather and his brother Nick, and 4 children, in a small apartment was a source of strife in my grandmother's life.